What's up, my world history people? Welcome to this week 5, or no, week 5 of lessons, and I guess we're going on week 7 of not seeing each other, which is kind of crazy to think about. So this week we're going to be talking about we're done with the Cold War. That was last week's lesson, was the end of that. We're jumping into the decolonization of Africa, which happened after World War II, basically. Still, in many ways, is still happening today. And it's something that began way back in the 1800s, 1700s, and 1600s. And we're going to analyze that whole history. As many of you know, we won't be back in school again this year, which is unfortunate. That's not a very good end to your freshman year. I'm sure not a lot of you are that upset probably, but make sure you stop by and say hi to me next year. And I hope everyone's safe and doing well. All right, so I'm going to jump in, share my screen. Hopefully it works this week. And then that's all I've got to really say. All I've got to say really right there. All right, so starting the decolonization of Africa. Colonization is when one country takes over another country, basically to capitalize on them and use their resources. So decolonization means basically breaking down those relationships between the countries. Countries will give up their control over other countries. So as we learned about during the Industrial Revolution and then during imperialism, there's several reasons why African countries were getting taken over. Hopefully a lot of you remember this, and this won't be too difficult of a lesson if you do. So in this lesson, we will analyze the effects of decolonization in Africa. Alrighty. So slide 6 is a nice warm-up asking you, I know you've heard of African countries, just jot down any countries that you've heard of before, which, like I said, I hope all of you have heard of some African countries. On this next slide, on slide 7, there is a great, once again, interactive timeline that talks about key events in the decolonization of the African continent. So independent Africa. We're gonna look here. Really, the decolonization of Africa started after 1945, after the end of World War II, and we'll talk about reasons that spark that here in a few minutes. But the reasons for colonization goes all the way back to the 16, 17, 1800s, right? The Industrial Revolution. As countries began to industrialize, the steam engines and better farming and factories and all those things we talked about that really started in England, they needed resources to produce goods, right? That was the whole point of industrialization. So if you have factories, you need resources, right? And so factories plus natural resources equals final goods, which you can then sell on the market and make money. So those resources needed to come from somewhere, and that somewhere was Africa for the most part, because they had so many abundant natural resources. We talked about the Scramble for Africa. That was something that we spent time on in class. And that's how countries like France, Belgium, Germany, they all competed to take over as many countries as possible in Africa. In 1884 and 1885, I hope all of you remember the Berlin Conference. That is when all those European countries got together. They did not invite any African leaders, and they divided up the African continent how they wanted to, not how tribal lines were drawn, not by traditional borders, how they wanted to. They just cut up the map of Africa. That's why the countries today are a bunch of random shapes. It's because Europeans drew them in the 1800s. All right, so the natural resources and racism, the two major reasons why Africa was fought over. Number one, they had just so many valuable resources that America does not have, Europe does not have. You know, copper, diamonds, gold, rubber, oil. I mean, those are the most valuable resources for all of history. They were very valuable in the 1700s, and they're still very valuable today. Oil is one of the most valuable goods in the world. Gold, the same. Diamond, same thing. And then also we learned about that white man's burden, ethnocentrism, which is if you go to college, you'll take probably a lot of classes that focus on ethnocentrism. But that's basically thinking that you and your culture are the best. You're at the top of the pyramid. All other cultures or races or groups of people are below you. Ethnocentrism, easy for me to say, basically is the belief in basically that you are the best, your culture is the best, all right? So Europeans, believing they were the best, they sought to civilize Africa and help them adopt Western values that Europeans had, make them better, they thought. That was the belief of the Europeans. That viewpoint was wrong. And we'll talk about a lot of ways that racism led to a lot of issues down the road. All right. So in the 1920s and 1930s, nationalism started to erupt, I would say. African nationalism embraced a philosophy called Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism was a movement that stressed unity for all Africans worldwide. It also called for the end of European involvement on the continent. So nationalism is the fierce belief or support for one's country or one's home. All right, so we have American nationalism is patriotism. We talked about. So Pan-Africanism is basically the belief in Africa's greatness in uniting all Africans worldwide together and getting Europeans out of the continent and getting control of Africa back to Africans where it should belong. That was starting to really take hold in the 1920s and 1930s. Still is going to take a long time. So changes after World War II. As we know, World War II was a global war and it decimated many of the top countries. Right? Many European countries that held colonies in Africa couldn't support those colonies anymore. They couldn't keep control over them because they had no resources, they had no military, they had no government, basically. Germany, Italy, those countries, France, were in ruins, and they couldn't support or take care of those colonies that were besieged. So the Fifth Pan-African Congress took place in 1945 in Manchester, England. And at this, basically the ball started to roll toward African independence and widespread African independence. So, new nations. So 1945, there were only 4 out of, like, I don't know, at one point in one of my college classes, we had to memorize every African country, which was very difficult to do because there's many African countries. So of all of these, what you see, is what Africa looks like today, only 4 of those were independent. The rest were colonies controlled by other countries. All right, by 1961, 27 of these countries were now independent. Right? So in 16 years, gained quite a few. All right, 23, still not enough though. A lot of those were violent revolutions. Some of those were nonviolent, and we'll look at a couple of those here. But even the countries that did gain independence, it wasn't an easy fix. There's still a lot of issues that today a lot of countries in Africa are still fighting or fighting over or dealing with because of the colonial rule that weakened them for so many years, hundreds of years. Some of these countries were controlled. So basically they were way behind. They were very far behind where they should have been, and that's still a large issue they're dealing with today. So African countries face and continue to face all of these, except for the Cold War. Cold War is not there anymore. So economic struggles, because they were relying on their colonial countries, European countries, they had very weak economies. Basically, they were just used for their resources. No industry was in Africa. They didn't make anything. They didn't have anything other than farming of their own. Europeans just took the resources and left. One-party dictatorships. A lot of harsh dictatorships existed in Africa and still exist in Africa. A lot of coups, Coup D'etat, That is a term, if you go to college, you'll also hear a lot. A coup, it basically is when the military overthrows the government and takes control. This has happened probably hundreds of times in Africa's history throughout all of the different countries. So coups are very common. We'll talk about a couple today. And then the Cold War, America and the Soviet Union also competed for influence within Africa, which didn't make anything better. So between economic struggles, dictatorships, and the Cold War, Africa had an uphill battle. Now, these next couple of slides are going to examine a couple African nations and their struggle for independence. So first we have Ghana. It was a British colony, and it became independent in 1957. This is on the western side of Africa, kind of on the, that's hard to explain. We'll look at a map later. Gold Coast, all right, because they had a lot of gold. Oops, I needed to do this. All right. They were socialist to begin, which meant they had socialist tendencies, kind of like communism's. Not as bad as communism, but not as, I don't know, intense as communism, I'd say, a soft communism. Cacao, so chocolate and gold, made them a lot of money, right? But over time, the government of Ghana became corrupt, and they lost a lot of money and went into debt. 1966, a coup overthrew the ruler, and many coups since then have weakened the government. In the early 2000s, the country finally transitioned into democracy, and they're still trying to build up the country today. So not a very, it was a very violent transition to democracy in Ghana. Kenya, also a British colony. Unfortunately, Kenya's freedom did not come peacefully, just like Ghana's didn't. Right? There were coups and revolutions. They gained their independence officially in 1963. Kenyatta, he was an African nationalist. He wanted to end British rule peacefully, but that didn't happen. So 1950s, farmers, traditional African farmers waged guerrilla warfare against the British, killing many. This rebellion continued over 10 years. They fought these guerrilla warfare battles. Kenyatta, the ruler up here, that wanted a peaceful transition to independence. He was believed to start the rebellion. He was imprisoned until 1961. And then after he was let out of prison, he led Kenya to their independence. Algeria is on the northern coast. Algeria, as you can see, is really close to Spain and Italy. So it shouldn't be a surprise that France, which is just above Spain, held this colony. In Morocco here, you can see Spain from Africa, and you can see Africa from Spain. So the continent of Africa is not very far from the continent of Europe. So because of oil, natural gas, Algeria had a lot of wealth. 1950s, Algerian Nationalists, so these were people loyal to Algeria, fought against the French, waged guerrilla warfare, and these were very, very long and dangerous and deadly wars. In 1962, Algeria won its independence, but the tensions between France and Algeria continued. Single political party, so basically a dictatorship, existed in 1965, and really up until today, it's been a tumultuous country, so a country that maybe wouldn't be the best to live in, but it has remained wealthy from its exports of natural resources like natural gas and oil. 1991, Algeria held free elections. The Islamist party voted into power, but the military overturned the election, resulting in a violent civil war again. This civil war ended in 1999. As you can imagine, Algeria is still trying to rebuild from that civil war, which was only 20 years ago. The Congo was Belgian. The Dutch controlled this colony starting from the 1800s. They were rich in diamonds and copper, blood diamonds, some of you might have heard of. All right, speaks right there, right? The violence that occurred over diamonds was terrible. Civil war between Katanga and Congo's national government began. Katanga wanted to kind of separate, become independent themselves, and that was a huge issue. So this Lumbudu or Lumumba, I said that wrong most likely, he was the leader of the newly independent Republic of the Congo. However, the Soviet Union basically allied with him. The United States allied with another leader, military leader, Mobutu. Right, Mobutu, who sided with America, eventually had Lumumba executed, killed. So in that proxy war between the Soviet Union and America, America won out. Mobutu staged a coup and took over the country. He ruled brutally for 30 years. All right, so as you can see, it's still not a very, there's still issues going on in the Congo today. All right, so South Africa and apartheid. I hope you all have learned about apartheid before. Apartheid was the long struggle between black and white South Africans that really has existed from the beginning in the 1600s. So this is South Africa. Obviously, it's the southernmost part of Africa. South Africa, that's a country. It was colonized by both the British and the Dutch, and it became fully independent in 1934. Apartheid were laws that we'll talk about here. They remained in effect for over 50 years. So really all the way up until 1990, these laws were in effect. Apartheid, it really began and the racism in South Africa began in the 1650s when the Dutch colonized or took over South Africa. These Dutch were called, they were Dutch farmers, they were called Boers, right? And these Boers clashed with native African groups, right? That makes sense, right? The Boers are taking over native African territory, and that's not going to go smoothly. They set up a couple independent states, and that was okay until the British finally took them over in the Anglo-Boer War in 1910, right? So in 1910, Great Britain established the Union of South Africa, which brought together all of South Africa together. There were no independent little cities in there. So that was the beginning. All right, so native white South Africans were called Afrikaners, right? And these were those white Boers with Dutch ancestry and British ancestry. They've maintained control of the government since the 1600s. Up until Nelson Mandela, which we'll talk about, was elected president, there were no not African American, but black or African leaders or politicians in South Africa's history. They were all basically white Afrikaners or Boers with British or Dutch ancestry. So many Afrikaners, these are white South Africans, believed in black South Africans, believed that they were inferior to whites. Once again, that ethnocentrism, right? That what was it, the white man's burden. They believed that it was their responsibility to civilize the black South Africans. Not true. It was unfortunate that it happened for so many years. Because the government was white, they created policies that restricted black and other non-white Africans from having access to jobs, land, voting rights, education, all of the above. So it wasn't just blacks that were discriminated against. It was Asians and Latins and all kinds of every other racial group other than white. So this, if you click on the, on slide 26, if you click on the little titles like Masters and Servant Act, Native Lands Act, all of these, they'll bring up little facts about it. So the Native Lands Act, this law reversed the majority of the land for white owners. It banned black South Africans from purchasing land outside the reserved areas. So we'll talk about here in a couple slides how black South Africans were basically put on if you know what Native American reservations are in America, this is what Black South Africans were put into little pieces of land, little pieces of territory where they had to live. They couldn't live in the cities where the white South Africans lived at. The Natives Urban Areas Act. This law restricted Black Africans from moving into cities to live. It also established segregation of white and non-white South Africans in urban areas. So urban areas, cities were primarily held for white South Africans, Afrikaners. Oops. Wi-Fi is a little slow here. All right. So 1948, this is when it started to get really bad. The South African government strengthened laws to separate the races. Right? The Afrikaner-led National Party put the apartheid system into effect in 1948. The following conditions were existed under apartheid. All South African citizens were divided into categories by your race, right? Your white, black, colored, which is mixed racial background, and Asian, including people from India. Non-white citizens had to carry identification papers and faced a lot of restrictions throughout the country. Marriage between races was forbidden. Public places were all segregated, and non-whites were limited in educational opportunities and other training for jobs. So they were really held down and prevented from getting ahead in life, which has led to, all across Africa, the lack of resources, poverty, education has really set Africa behind where they should be. So these colored areas on the map, the red, green, purple, blue, all of these are the areas where Black South Africans were put. So apartheid, this was a strategy under apartheid. In 1959, the South African government moved to further weaken non-whites. So there were 10 Bantustans, or homelands, shanty towns, created. They were small and highly populated. These areas kept Black South Africans divided geographically, thereby limiting their ability to organize and challenge apartheid policies. So down here, this is Cape Town. Big city Johannesburg was in here. So as you can see, the areas where the Black South Africans were forced to live were away from the major cities and away from where politics and the government were headquartered. So basically, they were keeping them away so they didn't cause any trouble or create any scenes. So resistance to apartheid really was there from the very beginning. But really started to take shape in the 1950s, 1960s, and so on. The African National Congress, which was a very big, or still is, protest group, and they fight for the rights of Black South Africans, really all South Africans. They fight for the betterment of everybody. They fought against these apartheid laws. As a result of some of these protests, in 1960, police forces shot 69 unarmed men, women, and children, which was a huge massacre that shocked people across the world and really made people see that, hey, things in South Africa are not very good, right? At the same time that this was going on, America was struggling with desegregation and civil rights. So unfortunately, Africa was not focused on for many years because America and many other countries were still trying to deal with the issues that were going on in their respective countries. But national or not global or worldly pressure in the end did force South Africa to stop apartheid. Nelson Mandela, this is a picture of him in 1944 as a young man. And Nelson, hopefully a lot of you have heard of Nelson Mandela, a huge figure of peace throughout the world. He, especially after the massacre I just talked about, helped lead the ANC, the African National Congress, protest and fight for the rights of Black South Africans. In 1964, he was imprisoned for what they said was sabotage and other, starting, riots and stuff like that, which he didn't necessarily. He was just a person that was kind of rebelling against the government, and they wanted to stop him. He was in jail or prison for 27 years. He continued to pursue his education. He got degrees while he was in prison in terrible conditions. He read. He still tried to lead the ANC and work with individuals to promote the rights of Black South Africans. Desmond Tutu is here on the left with the cross on. He was an Anglican bishop and a vocal apartheid, anti-apartheid leader. So together between Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela, both pictured here on slide 32, they were able to get not national, but global attention for apartheid and the issues with apartheid in South Africa. In 1984, Tutu won a Nobel Peace Prize for his work against apartheid. And I never knew this. Nobel Peace Prize winners win upwards of $500,000 when they win that prize, close to $600,000. Didn't know that. I thought you just got the prize and that was, that. But you can become very rich if you win it. A little fun fact. All right, so the end of apartheid. So by the 1980s, basically the whole world understood what was going on in South Africa, and that it was terrible and it had to stop. So the United Nations banned South Africa from participating in it. The United States and other nations put trade sanctions and other restrictions on the country. And in 1990, the South African president ended the ban on the African National Congress, released Mandela from prison, and in 1991, South Africa officially repealed apartheid. All right, so long history of segregation and racism in South Africa. Really the longest any country has really had to deal with this bad of racial segregation. America, even though it's not even good today, in some ways, was much further along in desegregation and civil rights than South Africa was. All right, so 1994, Mandela won as the presidential election, the first free and the first election that was open to individuals that were not white. Right, so everybody could run in this election in 1994. Mandela was the first Black president of South Africa. He served for a few years, working tirelessly to better Africa as a whole continent, but especially South Africa. So Mandela left the presidency in 1999. He served 5 years as president. He not only fought for poverty, education, but he also fought against the AIDS epidemic in Africa. And we'll learn here in a couple of slides how just how bad that AIDS epidemic really is. The video on slide 37 is a great video, very interesting video on Nelson Mandela's whole life. I encourage you to research Nelson Mandela, read about Nelson Mandela. Really a figure to look up to in regard to peace and civil rights and getting along, and how we all should act toward one another. So recovering from apartheid, they've done a pretty good job, South Africa, mainly because of the industries there. Their economy is really good. However, they still face issues like high crime rates because of the poverty and the unemployment, corruption in the government. So it's not, the best place to be right now. The government's not in the best shape, but it is it's maybe the best country within Africa as far as being the farthest along in regard to their economy and things like that. And they're not where they want to be, but they're getting there. All right. So they have tourism's big in South Africa too. There's those great white sharks down there. If anybody watches Shark Week. So I encourage you to do this lesson activity on slide 39. It's multi-part, but it really challenges you to think, and look at some of Mandela's beliefs and work. So conflicts and challenges in Africa still to this day, and there's a lot of those. So in the there are a lot of barriers, economic, political, socially, that Africa is still fighting to this day. The colonial legacies and history of Africa being ruled by European countries for so long really has set Africa back. They're not where they should be because of those reasons, and some other reasons just because it's Africa and the geography of the continent in general. So Sub-Saharan Africa, that's all on slide 42. The tan or beige color, that's Sub-Saharan Africa. So everywhere below the Saharan desert. The equator runs directly through Africa, and that presents a lot of challenges. It's very mountainous. You have volcanoes. You have a lot of deadly animals. You have very tropical hot weather. You have rainforests. You have deserts. It's not a great place if you're trying to make factories or make roads easily or grow crops. So because of all those reasons, Africa, just because of the continent, is behind, let alone not having governments that are functioning properly. So relying on single crops causes their economies to crumble, because if you're in a very tropical area, you might only be able to grow a couple crops such as coffee or berries or something of that nature, or if you're in the more plains area, the savanna, you might be able to grow corn or other crops, but you're really limited to one crop, and that's an issue if there's a drought or something like that. Also, like I said, the lack of manufacturing technologies and factories is bad. Right? There is a widespread lack of those, and if you can't make goods and make money that way, what's your economy going to do? So industrialization within Africa is slowly growing. Once again, because they were so far behind. Economic dependence, because Africa does not have a lot of capital or money to use to build these factories, they rely on loans from European countries, Asian countries, around the world, which only makes issues bigger because they're economically reliant on other countries and they're not self-sufficient. But taking those loans, and if countries can find a way to make money, is a great way to get on their feet. However, they have to use those funds in correct ways. Ethnic conflict is probably one of the biggest issues, or probably is the biggest issue affecting Africa in many ways still to this day. Because, like I said, in 1884, 1885, when all the Europeans carved up the African continent and drew the boundaries how they wanted to of the countries, that created issues because there were ethnic groups between different tribes within Africa that had existed for many years and continue to this day. So when the Europeans drew the countries, they didn't care about those ethnic issues. They just, they drew the line where they wanted to. And a lot of times, ethnic groups were brought into contact with each other and put in the same country, which is a massive issue. If you have two groups of people that hate each other, and you put them together in a country where they'd never been before, you're going to have some issues. So, for example, in Rwanda, there was a massive, and this was something I studied heavily in one of my college political science classes, a massive genocide, and we know what a genocide is. That's what the Holocaust was. The Hutu were one ethnic group within Rwanda, and the other were the Tutsis. And the Hutu and the Tutsis, the Hutu was the majority within the country, and the Tutsis were the minority. They were basically just massacring each other for a couple years. All right, in 1994, that's when it started. Around 800,000 people died in this. 800,000 people were just killed, and the violence was so it didn't even make sense. I mean, let's say a Hutu would show up on your doorstep, Hutu individual, and ask you who you voted for. If you said the wrong person, they just cut your head off with a machete or cut your arm off, all right, or killed your whole family and had you watch. It was crazy violence, just like that. Like if you voted for the wrong person, you're dead. Your whole family's dead. And this was 26 years ago. it wasn't even that long ago that this was happening. So in many ways, and this is still happening throughout Africa today, there's a lot of ethnic battles going on, and the UN, United Nations, is heavily involved in trying to peacefully negotiate a lot of these conflicts. But that's an interesting thing to research or read about if you have some free time, which I know a lot of you do. The education gap. This should be evident, right? Because of the lack of rights and the lack of money and the lack of resources that basically the entirety of Africa has had, poverty, the education system for the most part is terrible within Africa because of those reasons, which puts them farther behind. Water crisis, because of like the geography of Africa, like I've talked about, and the lack of the poverty, the lack of sewers. So basically drinking water mixes with sewage water. They're getting water out of rivers where animals are using the restroom or people are using the restroom. Clean water is hard to come by. Sanitation is hard to come by. Droughts a lot, just the lack of water is a huge barrier too. So education, ethnic crises, lack of industrialization, water shortages, all of these reasons are holding Africa back. Population boom, so their population is growing exponentially super fast, and their resources cannot sustain it. Africa is a huge continent. You could fit basically all of Europe and America inside of Africa and still have room left over. Much bigger than it looks on the map. So huge population. The AIDS crisis within Africa due to poverty. Once again, AIDS spreads super fast. About 70% of all HIV cases or AIDS cases take place in Africa. Lack of healthcare because of poverty and lack of industrialization, making the situation worse. So population boom, the AIDS crisis, poverty, ethnic conflict, water crisis, a bad education system. All of those issues are making Africa really work for the advancements that they are gaining. But they are making progress. A lot of countries are, like right here, it's talking about how Ethiopia, Nigeria, Kenya, and Ivory Coast have made a lot of improvement, and some of the world's fastest growing economies are in Africa as well. So there are some positives, but there's still a lot to do within Africa, still a lot of work that needs to be done. So I hope this wasn't too boring. I hope this lesson was pretty interesting. African history is very interesting. There's a lot of stuff and a very complex history to study. So if you have any free time, I encourage you to read more about the history of Africa. All right, so that is all we have for today. If you need anything, feel free to reach out to me. Message me on Plato. Send me an email. Check out my website. Go on to my YouTube and watch these videos like you are. So that's all I have for this week. Be productive, get your work done, stay up to date in all your classes, and have a good one. Catch you later.